In this video, I wrap up Abraham's life, starting at Genesis chapter 23, after Abraham has sacrificed Isaac to Elohim and then returned with his men to Beersheba. The 20 verses of chapter 23 are solely concerning the death and burial of Sarah. Now, women get little ink in the Bible, and their deaths usually get no mention. Can you, for instance, tell me how old any woman was in the Old Testament when she died? Or what happened to Mary, the supposed mother of our Saviour, after Jesus levitated? So why all the detail concerning Sarah's death? The most plausible reason, in my mind, is that this legend was written down to provide a strong connection between a later ruler and the city of Hebron. Just as any future ruler of the Israelites needed to prove their lineage back through the patriarchs, witness the contorted attempts at connecting Jesus back to King David, so any ruler who wanted to claim a piece of land as his own needed to be able to evidence a connection to said land in antiquity. And so some argue that it was in the time of David, who reigned from Hebron for 7 years and was anointed king of Israel there, that a historical link to Hebron was written into the Abrahamic legend. I'm not saying this is the case, simply giving you something you might want to read deeper into. So Sarah is 127 years old when she dies. That's 37 years after Isaac was born. There's no mention of anything that happened between the sacrifice of Isaac and Sarah's death, which was a period of anything from a couple of years to 22 years. The Bible does not state how old Isaac was at the time of his sacrifice, but the broad consensus is that he was probably in his late teens, early 20s. Abraham was not with Sarah when she died and instead specifically came to mourn her. Please note that Isaac is not involved in his mother's death scene whatsoever. You will also have noticed that throughout the Abraham cycle, he and Sarah were practically joined at the hip, apart from his chase up country to rescue Lot and his trip out to sacrifice Isaac. So we should not take the fact that he was separated from Sarah when she died as insignificant. The chronology we have is Elohim telling Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham obeying the command without discussing the issue with Sarah, 2 men go up a mountain, 1 man comes down, and then no mention of Abraham and Sarah in company again until Abraham alone, without Isaac, travels to her place of death to bury her. The early Jewish writers of the Midrash read much into this, but purely biblical. We really have nothing to go on. Sarah dies in Kirjath Arba, now known as Hebron, and probably meaning city of the four or city of Arba. In Joshua 14:15, Arba is linked eponymously with the earlier name for Hebron and styled as the greatest man amongst the Anakites. He had 3 sons, making 4 in total, and in Numbers we read that the Anakites, or Anakim, are a race of giants descended from the Nephilim. And this for me is the big story here. Forget how Noah fitted the animals on the ark. Forget about kinds and species. Here we have a city named after descendants of the Nephilim and inhabited by descendants of the Nephilim. How could that be when God supposedly wiped all life off the face of the earth, apart from Noah, his crew, and his cargo? The word Nephilim occurs only twice in the Old Testament, in Genesis chapter 6 and Numbers 13. In both cases, the King James translates Nephilim as giants. A very similar word is used in Ezekiel 32, where it is translated as fallen. The Hebrew word for fallen is given by Strong's as the root word of that translated as giants elsewhere. What is unarguable from the description of the Nephilim and their offspring, the Anakim, as mighty men, and that the Hebrews were as grasshoppers in their sight, is that the writers of the text wanted us to know that these were giants, both figuratively and physically. So does anyone want to venture an explanation as to how a race of people wiped out in the flood were later found inhabiting Hebron? Back to Genesis, and Abraham undertakes a protracted negotiation with the locals to purchase a piece of land, including the cave, in which he performs the first burial described in the Bible and inters Sarah's body. The children of Heth, who inhabited this area of Canaan, and from which Abraham purchased the burial place, have been linked to the Hittites, and indeed the King James provides Hittites as a translation. In the biblical narrative, Heth was a son of Canaan, son of Ham, son of Noah, and is thus assumed to be the eponymous progenitor of these people. Whether these Heth, a name which is derived from just 2 ancient Hebrew consonants, were the historical Hittites is open to much conjecture. It is currently accepted that the Hittite Empire at its height never came close to encompassing southern Canaan. The Hittite zenith was followed by the dark period of history known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. This collapse, possibly prompted by the cyclical climatic bond event, saw the collapse of many of the great powers of the Middle East and a great upheaval of civilization. As civilization then recovered, it was the Assyrians who took advantage, creating a vast empire which ruled the lands previously controlled by the Hittites, Egyptians, and Babylonians, amongst others. There appears no room in history for the Hittites to be lording it in Hebron at the time of Abraham. But that Hittites, dislocated by the upheavals of the Late Bronze Age collapse, might have been forced south into Hebron is very plausible. It might therefore be that this Late Bronze Age event, though out of step with the biblical Abrahamic chronology, is what we are seeing recorded in this story. Or it might simply be that the resemblance of the biblical name Heth to the ancient name of the Hittites is nothing more than coincidental. Of course, none of this explains what the sons of Heth are doing running things in a city named after the sons of the Nephilim, who will apparently be in charge of the same city later when Joshua and his warmongering offspring launch their divinely inspired baby-killing spree. Chapter 24 starts by telling us that Abraham was old and well stricken with age. In chapter 18, both Abraham and Sarah were already old and well stricken with age, and that was about 38 years ago. And in chapter 25 we will read, "Then Abraham gave up the ghost, and died in a good old age, an old man, and full of years." The writers want it to be very clear that Abraham was an old man when he died at the age of 175. The wording strongly implies that his life was especially long, perhaps not exceptional, but certainly worthy of note. Yet amongst his ancestors, only his grandfather Nahor died younger at 148, whereas his idolatrous pagan father Terah lived 30 years longer, and as we step backwards from Nahor, we find Serug 230, Ru 239, Peleg 239, Eber 464, Salah 433, Apashad 438, Shem 600, and Noah 950 years. So whilst the writers want to emphasize that this virtuous patriarch of the nation was favored with a longevity worthy of his divine patronage, the record books suggest something else. Back to chapter 24, and Abraham makes his servant swear an oath that he will find Isaac a bride from amongst his, Abraham's, own people, from the old country rather than the local Canaanites. The bull cupping ceremony completed, Abraham's servant heads off to Nahor in Mesopotamia to find Isaac a wife. Isaac's story will follow, and so I skip forward to chapter 25, where we find Abraham, who has been well stricken with age since he was 100 in chapter 18, now taking another wife, Keturah, at the age of around 140. He has another 6 sons with Keturah in quick succession, which must have had long barren and recently deceased Sarah turning in her cave. Again, these sons are presented as eponymous progenitors of ancient tribes. Whilst Keturah is first mentioned as Abraham's wife, verses 5 and 6 suggest that she was in fact a concubine, and 1 Chronicles 1 verse 32 would back this up. This is not a contradiction, of course. There are no contradictions in the Bible. So Keturah was Abraham's wife and his concubine. We see in chapter 25 that Isaac is Abraham's sole heir, and the offspring of his concuwife, Keturah, had all been kicked out of the tribe and sent elsewhere, whilst Abraham still lived. Abraham then dies at the age of 175, and is buried next to his wife's sister Sarah in Hebron. And Keturah, well, she did her biblical bit in producing sons, and we never hear from her again. Next time we have a look at Isaac's life after his miraculous resurrection. Thanks, as always, for watching.